The words were meant to be quiet, but in that sterile conference room, I heard every syllable as my daughter Rebecca leaned toward her husband's family and whispered, "It's all ours now." They smiled with the satisfied certainty of people who believed they'd just inherited everything my late husband Richard had worked 60 years to build. What none of them knew, what even I didn't know until that moment, was that Richard had included one final clause in his will that would change everything we thought we understood about loyalty, family, and who truly deserved to inherit a lifetime of hard work. But let me start from the beginning. Because this story isn't just about money or inheritance. It's about what happens when you discover that the people you trusted most have been planning to betray you all along. Richard and I had been married for 38 years when he passed away last spring. We'd built a life together that was modest by some standards, but rich in all the ways that mattered. Richard owned a successful plumbing business that he'd started from nothing when he was 22. Working 18-hour days and slowly building a reputation for honest work and fair prices. By the time he retired at 65, Henderson Plumbing employed 15 people and had contracts with half the commercial buildings in our town of Millbrook, Connecticut. We'd raised 3 children together: Rebecca, now 34, Michael, 31, and Daniel, 28. All 3 had grown up understanding the value of hard work, because Richard had made sure they earned everything they received. Summer jobs at the plumbing business, college tuition that came with the expectation of good grades, and down payments on their first homes that were gifts tied to demonstrated responsibility and achievement. Richard was old-fashioned in some ways, but his values were solid. He believed that wealth should be earned, that family loyalty was sacred, and that taking care of the people you loved meant teaching them to take care of themselves. He was generous with his children, but he was also careful not to create a sense of entitlement or dependency. "I want to give them a good start," he used to tell me, "but I don't want to give them so much that they stop trying." Of our 3 children, Rebecca had always been the most complicated. She was brilliant, graduated summa cum laude from Yale with a degree in business, but she'd also always had a sense of entitlement that worried both Richard and me. Even as a child, she'd expected special treatment because she was smart, because she was pretty, because she was the oldest. When Rebecca married Thomas Whitmore 5 years ago, Richard and I had reservations that we kept mostly to ourselves. Thomas came from old Connecticut money, the kind of family that had trust funds and country club memberships, and houses that had been in the family for generations. He was charming and intelligent, but there was something about the way he looked at Richard's business that made me uncomfortable. "He sees dollar signs when he looks at Dad," Michael had said to me privately after the wedding. "I don't think he married Rebecca for love. I think he married her for what he thought she'd inherit." At the time, I dismissed Michael's concerns as sibling rivalry. Rebecca was my daughter, and I wanted to believe she'd chosen well. But as the years passed, I began to notice things that supported Michael's assessment. Thomas would ask pointed questions about Richard's business finances during family dinners. He'd make suggestions about maximizing the value of Richard's commercial properties. He'd talk about the potential of the plumbing business if it were properly leveraged and strategically expanded. More troubling was the way Rebecca began to change after marrying Thomas. She'd always been somewhat materialistic, but marriage to Thomas seemed to amplify her focus on wealth and status. She started making comments about how undervalued Richard's business was, how he could be making so much more money if he were more aggressive about pricing and expansion. "Dad's too nice," she told me during one particularly uncomfortable conversation. "He could be rich if he just charged what the market will bear instead of worrying about being fair to his customers." The fact that Rebecca saw her father's integrity and fairness as weaknesses rather than strengths was deeply concerning to me. But Richard brushed off my worries. "She's young," he'd say. "She'll learn that there are more important things than money." But Rebecca didn't seem to be learning that lesson. If anything, her marriage to Thomas was pulling her further away from the values Richard and I had tried to instill in her. The Whitmore family, meanwhile, treated Richard and me with polite condescension that they probably thought we didn't notice. Thomas's mother, Victoria, would smile tightly when she asked about Richard's little plumbing business, and his father, Charles, would nod indulgently when Richard talked about his work as if it were a quaint hobby rather than a serious enterprise. "It must be so rewarding to work with your hands," Victoria said to Richard during one particularly painful family gathering. Thomas's grandfather always said there was something noble about manual labor. The subtle insult, categorizing Richard as a manual laborer rather than a successful business owner, wasn't lost on any of us. But Richard, ever the gentleman, simply smiled and changed the subject. What the Whitmores didn't understand was that Richard's business was worth significantly more than they realized. He'd been conservative about discussing finances, even with family, but I knew that Henderson Plumbing was valued at well over $2 million, and that was before considering Richard's real estate investments and other assets. Richard had always been private about money, believing that discussing wealth was vulgar and that it created unhealthy dynamics within families. But as his health began to decline over the past 2 years, he'd started making plans for how to distribute his assets in a way that would benefit all our children, while protecting them from making poor decisions. "I want to be fair," he told me during one of our conversations about estate planning, "but I also want to be smart. Money can destroy families if it's not handled carefully." Richard spent months working with his lawyer, James Morrison, to create a will that reflected his values and his concerns about each of our children's financial maturity. He told me the general outline. The business would be divided among all 3 children. The house and other assets would be split fairly, and there would be provisions to ensure that everyone was taken care of. But Richard had kept the specific details private, saying he wanted to avoid any family conflicts or lobbying that might arise if people knew exactly what they stood to inherit. "The will reading will be the first time anyone knows the details," he'd told me. "That way, no one can argue or try to influence decisions that have already been made." Richard passed away in March after a brief but aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. The funeral was large and well attended, reflecting the respect he'd earned in our community over 4 decades of honest business and generous community involvement. The Whitmores attended, of course, and I noticed that Thomas seemed particularly interested in offering condolences to Richard's business partners and key customers. "Just maintaining relationships," Thomas explained when I mentioned his networking behavior at his father-in-law's funeral. "I'm sure that's what Richard would have wanted." But I suspected Thomas's motives were more self-interested than he was letting on. In the weeks following the funeral, Rebecca became increasingly focused on the practical aspects of settling Richard's estate. She volunteered to handle communications with the lawyer, to organize Richard's business files, and to help me navigate the complex financial arrangements that would need to be addressed. "You shouldn't have to worry about all these details while you're grieving, Mom," Rebecca said with what seemed like genuine concern. "Let Thomas and me handle the business side of things so you can focus on taking care of yourself." I appreciated the gesture, but something about Rebecca's eagerness to insert herself into the estate planning process made me uncomfortable. When I mentioned my concerns to Michael and Daniel, they shared my uneasiness. "Rebecca's been asking a lot of questions about Dad's assets," Daniel told me. "She wanted to know about his life insurance policies, his retirement accounts, the business valuation. It feels like she's trying to get a head start on understanding what she's inheriting." Michael had similar observations. "She keeps talking about what we are going to do with the business, like she's assuming she's going to be the one making decisions about it." The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Rebecca had been positioning herself as Richard's natural successor for years, despite the fact that both Michael and Daniel had also worked for their father's business during summers and school breaks, and both had expressed interest in potentially taking over the company someday. Rebecca, meanwhile, had never shown any interest in the plumbing business until she married Thomas and started talking about its potential as an investment opportunity. The will reading was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks after Richard's funeral. James Morrison had asked all the beneficiaries to attend: me, all 3 children, and Thomas as Rebecca's husband. The Whitmores had also requested to be present, which struck me as presumptuous, but which James had agreed to accommodate. "It's unusual for in-laws to attend will readings," James had told me privately, but Rebecca insisted that Thomas's family should be there since they're now part of the family. Richard didn't specify who could attend, so I can't legally exclude them. I agreed to let the Whitmores attend, partly because I didn't want to create family conflict during an already difficult time, and partly because I was curious about why they felt entitled to be present at the reading of my husband's will. We gathered in James Morrison's conference room on a gray April afternoon that felt appropriately somber for the occasion. The room was formal and intimidating, with dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes. James sat at the head of a long mahogany table, with Richard's will and various supporting documents arranged in neat stacks in front of him. I sat to James's right, with Michael and Daniel beside me. Rebecca and Thomas sat across from us, with Victoria and Charles Whitmore flanking them like some kind of support team. The arrangement felt adversarial in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. "Before we begin," James said, looking around the table with the serious demeanor of someone who'd presided over many such gatherings, "I want to remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding. Richard's will is a binding document that reflects his final wishes, and those wishes will be respected regardless of anyone's personal feelings about the contents." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the room. "Richard Henderson was very specific about how he wanted his assets distributed. and he spent considerable time ensuring that his will accurately reflected his values and his assessment of what would be best for his family. I encourage everyone to listen carefully and to remember that Richard's decisions were made with love and careful consideration. James opened the will and began reading the standard legal language that opened such documents. As he progressed through the preliminary sections, I found myself studying the faces around the table. Michael and Daniel looked nervous but respectful. Rebecca looked confident, almost smug, as if she already knew what was coming. Thomas was taking notes on a legal pad, and the Whitmores were leaning forward with the focused attention of people who expected to hear something that would affect them directly. The first major provision of the will addressed Richard's life insurance policies and retirement accounts, which were being left entirely to me. This was expected and uncontroversial. Richard had always said he wanted to ensure I was financially secure for the rest of my life. The second section dealt with personal property and family heirlooms. Richard had been thoughtful about distributing meaningful items among all 3 children, with specific pieces going to specific people based on memories and personal connections rather than monetary value. Then James reached the section about Richard's business assets, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Regarding Henderson Plumbing and its associated assets, James read, Richard has made the following provisions. He paused, looking up at the assembled group with an expression I couldn't quite read. The business will be divided equally among Richard's 3 children, Rebecca, Michael, and Daniel, with each receiving a 1/3 ownership stake. Rebecca's smile faltered slightly at the word equally, but she recovered quickly. Thomas scribbled something on his notepad and showed it to Rebecca, who nodded. However, James continued, the management and operational control of the business will be determined by a separate provision that Richard included to ensure the company's continued success and stability. This was where things got interesting. I could see Rebecca leaning forward, clearly expecting to hear that she would be taking over management of the business. Richard has appointed Michael Henderson as the managing partner of Henderson Plumbing, with full operational authority and decision-making power over all business matters. The color drained from Rebecca's face. What do you mean, managing partner? She asked, her voice sharp with surprise and displeasure. Michael will have complete control over all business operations, hiring, contracts, and strategic decisions, James explained. While Rebecca and Daniel will receive equal financial benefits from their ownership stakes, Michael will be responsible for running the company. But that's not fair, Rebecca protested. I'm the oldest, and I have a business degree from Yale. Why would Dad give management control to Michael? James consulted the will before responding. Richard included a letter explaining his reasoning, which I am authorized to read aloud. He pulled out a sealed envelope and opened it, revealing several pages in Richard's familiar handwriting. To my children, James read, I have given much thought to how to divide my business assets in a way that will benefit all of you while ensuring the continued success of Henderson Plumbing. The room was completely silent as James continued reading Richard's words. Rebecca, you are brilliant and accomplished, and I am proud of your academic achievements. However, over the past several years, I have observed that your approach to business is focused primarily on maximizing profit rather than maintaining the relationships and reputation that are the foundation of any successful enterprise. Rebecca's face was turning red with embarrassment and anger. Michael, you have worked alongside me for summers and school breaks since you were 16. You understand the values that built this business, and you share my commitment to fair dealing and honest work. I trust you to maintain the integrity of Henderson Plumbing while growing it responsibly. James paused to look at Michael, who seemed stunned by this expression of his father's confidence. Daniel, you have chosen a different career path, but you have always supported the family business and understood its importance. Your ownership stake will provide you with financial security while allowing you to pursue your own professional goals. The letter continued with some personal messages for each child, but the business provisions were clear. Michael would run the company, and Rebecca would be a silent partner with no operational control. As James finished reading Richard's letter, I could see Thomas whispering urgently to Rebecca, who looked like she was struggling to contain her anger. That's when I heard it, Rebecca leaning over to Victoria Whitmore and whispering, "It's all ours now." The words were meant to be quiet, but in the tense silence of the conference room, they carried clearly enough for everyone to hear. Victoria smiled and nodded, and I realized with a chill that Rebecca and the Whitmores had been planning for this moment for years. They thought Rebecca's inheritance would give them control over Richard's business, regardless of what the will actually said. They were already making plans to override Richard's wishes and take control of everything he'd built, but they had celebrated too soon. James was still holding the will, and I could see that there were more pages to read. "That concludes the main provisions of Richard's will," James said, looking around the table with an expression that suggested he wasn't quite finished. However, Richard included one additional clause that he characterized as his final insurance policy. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Rebecca and Thomas were staring at James with obvious concern, clearly sensing that something unexpected was coming. "This final clause," James continued, was designed to address a specific concern that Richard had about how his assets might be used after his death. He turned to a new page and began reading again. If, at any time during the first 5 years following my death, any of my children attempts to sell, transfer, or otherwise dispose of their ownership stake in Henderson Plumbing, without the unanimous consent of all 3 siblings, that person's entire inheritance, including their business ownership, their share of my personal assets, and any other bequests, will be immediately forfeited and redistributed equally among my surviving children. The room erupted. Rebecca shot to her feet so quickly that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a sharp crack that echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. "What the hell does that mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and panic that I'd never heard from her before. Thomas was frantically flipping through his notes, as if the answer to this unexpected complication might be hidden in his careful observations of the earlier proceedings. Victoria and Charles Whitmore looked like they'd been physically struck, their faces pale and their mouths hanging open in shock. "It means," James said calmly, maintaining the professional composure that had undoubtedly served him well through decades of contentious legal proceedings, "that your father anticipated the possibility that someone might try to circumvent his wishes regarding the business." "But that's insane!" Rebecca practically shouted. "You can't just take away someone's inheritance because they want to make smart financial decisions." Michael and Daniel were staring at their sister with expressions of dawning understanding. I could see them processing not just the legal implications of Richard's final clause, but the more troubling realization that Rebecca's reaction suggested she had indeed been planning to do exactly what Richard had tried to prevent. "Rebecca," Michael said quietly, "why are you so upset about this unless you were planning to sell your share?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions: anger, embarrassment, defiance, and finally a kind of calculated determination that chilled me to the bone. "Don't be naive, Michael," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Dad's business is worth millions, but it's all tied up in equipment and contracts and buildings. The smart thing to do would be to liquidate the assets and invest the money properly, instead of playing around with pipes and toilets for the rest of our lives." The casual dismissal of Richard's life's work, referring to a successful business that employed 15 people and served hundreds of customers as "playing around with pipes and toilets," was breathtaking in its callousness. "That business put you through Yale," Daniel said, his voice tight with anger. "It paid for your wedding, your house, your car. Everything you have came from Dad working with those pipes and toilets." Rebecca waved dismissively at Daniel's words. "And I'm grateful for that. But gratitude doesn't mean we have to make stupid decisions going forward. Thomas's family knows about investments and wealth management. They could help us turn Dad's assets into something much more valuable than a small-town plumbing business." Thomas finally looked up from his notes, and when he spoke, his tone was carefully measured, but his words were revealing. "What Rebecca is saying is that there are opportunities to maximize the value of Richard's estate through strategic asset management that wouldn't be possible if the business remains operational in its current form." The corporate speak was clearly meant to make their plans sound more respectable, but what I heard was a cold calculation that reduced Richard's legacy to a collection of assets to be harvested for maximum profit. "You want to sell everything," I said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. "You want to liquidate Dad's business, sell the buildings, get rid of the employees, and cash out." "We want to be smart about our inheritance," Rebecca replied defensively. "There's nothing wrong with that. There's everything wrong with it," Michael said, his voice rising with emotion. "Dad didn't build that business just to make money. He built it to create something lasting, something that would serve the community and provide good jobs for people who depend on us. You're talking about destroying 40 years of work for a quick payout." Victoria Whitmore finally found her voice, and when she spoke, her tone carried the entitled authority of someone who was used to having her opinions taken seriously, simply because of her social position. "I think you're all being rather emotional about this," she said with icy condescension. "Business is business, and sentiment doesn't pay bills or create wealth. Rebecca has a right to make decisions about her own inheritance." "Actually," James interjected, "she doesn't. Not according to Richard's will." He held up the document and continued reading from the clause that had caused such uproar. "Furthermore, any attempt to pressure, coerce, or conspire with other beneficiaries to circumvent this provision will result in the immediate forfeiture of all inheritance rights, with the forfeited assets being donated to charity." The silence that followed this addition was deafening. Rebecca sank back into her chair, looking like she'd been slapped. Thomas's pen had stopped moving across his notepad, and the Whitmores were staring at James as if he'd just announced that gravity had been repealed. "How could Dad do this to us?" Rebecca whispered. And for the first time since the reading had begun, she sounded more hurt than angry. "Didn't he trust me? Didn't he think I was capable of making good decisions?" The pain in her voice was genuine, but it was also revealing. Rebecca seemed to honestly believe that liquidating her father's business for maximum profit constituted a good decision, regardless of the impact on employees, customers, or the community that had supported the Henderson family for decades. I think, James said gently, that your father trusted you to make the decisions that were right for you, but he also wanted to ensure that those decisions wouldn't destroy what he'd spent his lifetime building. He closed the will and looked around the table at the assembled family members. Richard spent months crafting these provisions. He consulted with business advisors, financial planners, and estate attorneys to make sure his wishes were legally sound and practically enforceable. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully considered plan designed to protect his legacy while providing for his family. Charles Whitmore spoke for the first time since the reading had begun, his voice carrying the frustrated authority of a man who was used to finding ways around inconvenient rules. "Surely there must be some way to challenge this," he said to James. "These kinds of restrictive provisions can often be overturned if they're deemed unreasonable or contrary to the beneficiary's best interests." James's response was swift and decisive. Richard anticipated that possibility as well. "The will includes provisions for a legal defense fund specifically designated to fight any challenges to his wishes." He was very determined that his final decisions would be respected. The thoroughness of Richard's planning was becoming clear, and I felt a surge of pride in my husband's foresight and determination. He'd known his daughter well enough to anticipate her likely reactions, and he'd prepared accordingly. Thomas finally put down his pen and looked directly at Michael. "What if we were to propose a different arrangement? What if Rebecca sold her share to you and Daniel instead of to outside investors? That way, the business would stay in the family, but Rebecca could still access her inheritance." It was a clever suggestion, and for a moment I thought it might represent a reasonable compromise. But Michael's response showed that he understood the deeper implications better than I initially had. "With what money?" Michael asked. "Daniel and I don't have millions of dollars sitting around to buy out Rebecca's share, and even if we could arrange financing, we'd be taking on debt that would cripple the business and probably force us to make exactly the kinds of profit-maximizing decisions that Dad was trying to prevent." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Besides, if Rebecca gets a big payout now, what's to stop her from pressuring us to sell in a few years when the 5-year restriction expires? This isn't really about solving the immediate problem. It's about whether we're committed to continuing what Dad built or whether we're just looking for ways to cash out." The conversation was revealing fault lines in our family that I'd hoped didn't exist. It was becoming clear that Rebecca and Thomas had been planning for this inheritance for years, viewing Richard's business as their ticket to a different kind of lifestyle. The Whitmores, meanwhile, seemed to see Richard's assets as an opportunity to increase their own family's wealth and influence. Rebecca stood up again, but this time her movement was slower, more deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was cold and calculating. "Fine," she said. "If that's how Dad wanted to play it, then that's how we'll play it. But don't think this is over. I'm going to talk to my own lawyers about challenging this will, and I'm going to explore every possible option for getting what I'm entitled to." "What you're entitled to," I said, finally finding my voice after listening to this painful family confrontation, "is exactly what your father left you. A 1/3 stake in a successful business that will provide you with income for the rest of your life, along with the knowledge that you're continuing something meaningful that he built." Rebecca turned to look at me with an expression of pure frustration. "You don't understand, Mom. Thomas and I have plans. We've been counting on this inheritance to start our own investment firm, to build something bigger than a small-town plumbing business. We can't do that if our money is tied up in Dad's company." The admission was stunning in its selfishness. Rebecca had been viewing her father's death not as a loss to be grieved, but as a business opportunity to be exploited. She'd been making plans for his money while he was still alive, counting on an inheritance to fund her own ambitions. "Rebecca," Michael said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "Dad wasn't even dead for 2 months before you started talking about what you were going to do with his business. Don't you think that says something about your priorities?" "My priorities are perfectly reasonable," Rebecca shot back. "I'm thinking about the future, about building wealth and creating opportunities. That's what successful people do. Successful people also honor their commitments and respect the people who gave them opportunities in the first place," Daniel said quietly. "Dad trusted us with his legacy. The least we can do is try to be worthy of that trust." Thomas gathered his notes and stood up, clearly recognizing that this conversation wasn't going in a direction that would benefit his family's plans. "I think we need some time to process all of this," he said with the diplomatic tone of someone who was used to managing difficult negotiations. "Obviously, this isn't what any of us expected, and there are a lot of implications to consider." Victoria Whitmore rose as well, her face set in the kind of rigid composure that wealthy people often adopt when things don't go their way. "Rebecca, dear," she said with icy formality, "I think Thomas is right. You should take some time to explore your options before making any hasty decisions." The phrase, "explore your options," was clearly code for, find a way to get around Richard's restrictions and I felt a surge of protective anger on behalf of my late husband's wishes. "There are no options to explore," I said firmly. "Richard's will is clear, it's legal, and it's final. The only question is whether Rebecca is going to honor her father's wishes or spend the next 5 years fighting a battle she can't win." Rebecca looked at me with an expression that was equal parts anger and betrayal. "I can't believe you're taking their side against your own daughter." "I'm not taking anyone's side," I replied. "I'm defending your father's right to distribute his own assets according to his own judgment. And I'm trying to protect the business and the employees who depend on it from being destroyed for someone else's financial gain." The accusation that I was choosing the business over my daughter was painful, but it was also revealing. Rebecca seemed to genuinely believe that loving her meant supporting her plans to liquidate her father's life's work, regardless of the consequences for anyone else. James Morrison had been quietly organizing his papers during this family confrontation, but now he cleared his throat to regain everyone's attention. "Before everyone leaves," he said, "there are a few practical matters we need to address regarding the immediate management of Richard's assets." He turned to Michael with an expression of professional sympathy. "You'll need to meet with the business accountant and the key employees as soon as possible to ensure a smooth transition of management responsibilities. Richard left detailed instructions about ongoing contracts and client relationships that you'll need to review." Michael nodded, looking overwhelmed by the sudden weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. "There are also some specific provisions regarding the family home and other personal assets that we'll need to discuss separately," James continued, looking at me. "Richard wanted to make sure you had complete financial security and independence, regardless of any family conflicts that might arise." The phrase, "family conflicts that might arise," suggested that Richard had anticipated exactly the kind of confrontation we'd just witnessed. Once again, I was struck by my husband's foresight and his deep understanding of the people he loved. Rebecca gathered her purse and coat with sharp, angry movements that made her feelings clear without requiring words. "This isn't over," she said to the room in general. "Dad may have thought he could control us from beyond the grave, but there are always ways around these kinds of restrictions if you're smart enough to find them." The threat was unmistakable, and I felt a chill of apprehension about what Rebecca and the Whitmores might be planning. As the family filed out of the conference room, I remained seated, feeling emotionally drained by the confrontation and the revelations about my daughter's character that it had prompted. James Morrison sat beside me, waiting patiently while I processed everything that had just happened. "He knew," I said finally. "Richard knew exactly what she was planning, didn't he?" James nodded gravely. "Richard was very concerned about Rebecca's marriage and its influence on her values. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to protect his legacy while still providing for all his children equally." "Do you think she'll really try to challenge the will?" "She might," James replied, "but Richard made sure the legal structure was as solid as possible. Any successful challenge would require proving that Richard was incompetent when he made these decisions, and there's extensive documentation of his mental clarity and careful deliberation." I sat in the quiet conference room for several more minutes, thinking about the daughter I'd raised and wondering how we'd gotten to this point. Rebecca had always been ambitious and somewhat materialistic, but I'd never imagined she was capable of the kind of cold calculation she'd displayed during the will reading. As I finally gathered my things to leave, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. Richard's will had prevented Rebecca from immediately liquidating his business, but it hadn't changed her fundamental motivations or eliminated her determination to find a way around his restrictions. The next 5 years were going to test not just the legal strength of Richard's final wishes, but the very bonds that held our family together, and I wasn't sure we were all going to survive intact. Rebecca's campaign to undermine Richard's will began within 48 hours of the reading. She hired Bradley, Stevens & Associates, one of Hartford's most aggressive estate litigation firms, and launched a multi-pronged attack that was as sophisticated as it was ruthless. The first salvo came in the form of a formal legal challenge, claiming that Richard had been suffering from early-stage dementia when he crafted the restrictive clauses of his will. Rebecca's lawyers had somehow obtained Richard's medical records, and were arguing that his cancer treatment medications had affected his judgment and decision-making capacity. "It's complete nonsense," James Morrison told me during an emergency meeting in his office 3 days after the will reading. "Richard underwent comprehensive cognitive testing as part of the estate planning process. We have documentation from 2 independent physicians confirming his mental competency at the time he signed the will." But Rebecca's legal strategy was more complex than a simple competency challenge. Her lawyers were also arguing that the restrictive clauses constituted an unreasonable restraint on alienation that violated Connecticut state law regarding property rights. "What does that mean in plain English?" I asked James, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden barrage of legal terminology that was being thrown around. "They're arguing that Richard can't legally prevent his children from selling their inheritance," James explained. "It's a more sophisticated challenge, and while I believe we can defeat it, It's going to require significant time and money to fight. The money part was particularly concerning. Richard had established a legal defense fund, but Rebecca's challenge was clearly designed to be expensive and time-consuming. Her lawyers were filing motion after motion, requesting extensive discovery, and demanding depositions from everyone who had been involved in Richard's estate planning process. "They're trying to bleed us dry," Michael said during a family meeting at my house later that week. "Even if we win, the legal costs could cripple the business." Daniel looked exhausted from trying to juggle his own job while helping Michael manage the sudden crisis. "And that's probably the point. If they can't get the will overturned, they'll settle for weakening the business enough that we'll be forced to sell." What made the situation even more painful was that Rebecca's legal assault was being conducted with the full financial backing of the Whitmore family. Thomas's father had apparently decided that this was a battle worth fighting, and he was providing unlimited resources to ensure that Rebecca's challenge had the best possible chance of success. "Charles Whitmore sees this as an investment," I told James during one of our strategy sessions. "If Rebecca wins, the Whitmores gain access to millions of dollars in assets that they can fold into their own investment portfolio. They're not just supporting their daughter-in-law, they're funding a hostile takeover of my husband's legacy." The personal cost of the legal battle was even higher than the financial one. The family was fracturing along lines that seemed to become more entrenched with each passing week. Rebecca had stopped speaking to Michael and Daniel entirely, communicating only through her lawyers even about basic family matters. When my mother, Rebecca's grandmother, died unexpectedly in May, 2 months after the will reading, Rebecca attended the funeral but sat with the Whitmores rather than with her own family. She didn't speak to me, Michael, or Daniel during the entire service, and she left immediately after the burial, without offering condolences or participating in the family gathering that followed. "She's not the daughter I raised," I confided to my sister Patricia during a particularly difficult phone call. "I don't know what happened to her, but the Rebecca who's fighting this battle isn't someone I recognize." "Money changes people," Patricia replied, "and sometimes it reveals who they really were all along." The observation was painful, but probably accurate. Rebecca's behavior during the will contest was showing aspects of her character that had been subtle enough to overlook when the stakes were lower, but which became impossible to ignore when millions of dollars were at stake. Meanwhile, Michael was struggling to learn how to run Henderson Plumbing, while simultaneously defending his right to do so. Richard had left detailed instructions and had arranged for the company's longtime foreman, Pete Rodriguez, to help with the transition, but the stress of the legal battle was making everything more difficult. "I feel like I'm failing Dad," Michael told me during one particularly dark moment in July. "The business is suffering because I'm spending so much time dealing with lawyers instead of learning how to manage the company. And the employees are starting to worry about their job security because of all the uncertainty." The uncertainty was justified. Rebecca's legal challenge was creating a cloud over the business that was affecting customer confidence and employee morale. Several longtime clients had started asking questions about the company's stability, and 2 employees had left for other jobs rather than risk being caught up in a family dispute that might result in the business being sold or closed. But if Michael was struggling with the pressure, he was also growing into the role his father had envisioned for him. He'd started attending trade association meetings and networking events, building relationships with suppliers and customers that went beyond the foundation Richard had established. He was learning to balance the traditional values of honest work and fair dealing that had built Henderson Plumbing with the modern business practices necessary for continued growth. "Dad was right about Michael," Daniel told me after visiting the company's main office. "He really does understand what the business is about, and the employees respect him. If we can get through this legal nightmare, I think he's going to do great things with the company." The legal nightmare, however, was intensifying rather than resolving. By August, Rebecca's lawyers had expanded their strategy to include personal attacks on Michael's competence and character. They were arguing that even if Richard's will was valid, Michael was too young and inexperienced to manage a multi-million-dollar enterprise effectively. "They're requesting a court-appointed business manager," James told me during one of our increasingly frequent strategy meetings. "Someone who would oversee all major business decisions until the legal challenge is resolved." The prospect of having a stranger make decisions about Richard's company was almost as troubling as the possibility of Rebecca winning her challenge outright. A court-appointed manager would have no emotional investment in preserving the company's culture and values, and would likely make decisions based purely on short-term financial considerations. It was during this particularly dark period that I made a discovery that changed everything about how I viewed Rebecca's legal challenge. I was cleaning out some of Richard's papers in his home office when I found a folder I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind his filing cabinet in a way that suggested it had been deliberately hidden. Inside were copies of emails and text messages that Richard had somehow obtained, documenting communications between Rebecca, Thomas, and the Whitmores dating back almost 2 years. The earliest messages, from shortly after Richard's cancer diagnosis, showed Rebecca and Thomas discussing inheritance planning with a cold calculation that made my blood run cold. The old man's not going to last much longer, Thomas had written to his father in an email dated 6 months before Richard's death. Rebecca thinks the business is worth at least $3 million. Maybe more. If we can get control of her share, we could liquidate the assets and use the capital to fund our investment firm. Rebecca's response to a similar message from Victoria Whitmore was even more revealing. I know Michael and Daniel will want to keep playing with Dad's little business, but they don't understand real money. Once I inherit my share, I'll find a way to force a sale. Thomas's family knows how to turn assets into wealth. The messages continued through Richard's illness and death, documenting a detailed plan to circumvent whatever restrictions he might put in place. The Whitmores had apparently consulted with their own estate attorneys about strategies for challenging restrictive will provisions, and they'd been feeding information to Rebecca about the best ways to build a legal case. But the most damaging revelation was in a text message Rebecca had sent to Thomas just 2 weeks before Richard's death. Make sure you're extra nice to Dad when we visit. We need him to think we respect the business, so he doesn't get suspicious about our plans. The messages showed that Rebecca had been deceiving Richard during his final weeks, pretending to honor his values and legacy, while secretly planning to destroy everything he'd built. She'd used his illness and vulnerability to gain his trust, all while plotting to betray that trust the moment he was gone. I sat in Richard's office for a long time, holding the folder and trying to process the depth of Rebecca's betrayal. This wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about fundamental dishonesty and manipulation that went to the core of who my daughter had become. When I showed the messages to James Morrison, his reaction was swift and decisive. "This changes everything," he said after reviewing the documents. "These communications show premeditation and conspiracy to defraud the estate. They also demonstrate that Rebecca's legal challenge is being made in bad faith, which could result in sanctions against her and her attorneys." James immediately filed a motion to have Rebecca's entire legal challenge dismissed, attaching the email and text message evidence as exhibits. The response from Rebecca's lawyers was predictably furious. They claimed the messages had been obtained illegally and should be excluded from consideration, but the damage was done. The communications showed clearly that Rebecca had been planning to circumvent Richard's wishes regardless of what his will contained, and that her legal challenge was simply another tool in a premeditated campaign to gain control of assets she felt entitled to. The judge assigned to the case, the Honorable Margaret Chen, reviewed the evidence during a closed hearing that I was permitted to attend. Judge Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for cutting through legal maneuvering to focus on the substance of disputes. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Chen said to Rebecca, who was sitting with her legal team at the plaintiff's table, "these communications suggest that you began planning to dispose of your father's assets before he was even deceased. Is that accurate?" Rebecca's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Kevin Bradley, stood to respond. "Your Honor, private family communications taken out of context cannot be used to—" "I'm not asking you, Mr. Bradley," Judge Chen interrupted. "I'm asking your client, Ms. Whitmore. Did you discuss plans to liquidate your father's business before his death?" Rebecca looked trapped, clearly aware that lying under oath would create even bigger problems, but also reluctant to admit the truth about her planning. "My husband and I discussed various possibilities for managing inheritance assets," she said carefully. "That's normal financial planning." "Normal financial planning," Judge Chen repeated, looking down at the documents in front of her. "Is it normal financial planning to refer to your father's life's work as playing with Dad's little business? Is it normal to discuss forcing a sale before you even know what your inheritance will include?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and I could see Rebecca's lawyers exchanging worried glances. Judge Chen continued her review of the evidence, reading key passages aloud in a way that made Rebecca's deception impossible to deny or minimize. "According to these communications," Judge Chen said, "you and your husband's family had decided to liquidate Henderson Plumbing regardless of your father's wishes, and your current legal challenge is simply an attempt to remove obstacles to that predetermined plan." She looked up from the documents and fixed Rebecca with a stern stare. "Is that an accurate characterization of your motivations?" Rebecca's lawyer tried again to object, but Judge Chen cut him off with a gesture. "Your Honor," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I believe my father's restrictions are unreasonable and contrary to sound financial management." "That's not what I asked," Judge Chen replied. "I asked whether you had already decided to sell the business before you knew what restrictions your father had put in place." The silence stretched for almost a full minute before Rebecca finally answered, "Yes." The admission was devastating, and I could see the impact it had on everyone in the courtroom. Rebecca had essentially confessed that her legal challenge was not based on any legitimate objection to Richard's will, but was simply an attempt to clear the way for plans she'd made while he was still alive. Judge Chen set down the documents and looked around the courtroom with an expression of obvious displeasure. "It is the court's preliminary finding that this challenge to Richard Henderson's will is being pursued in bad faith and for improper purposes, she announced. The plaintiff appears to be seeking judicial assistance in implementing a premeditated plan to circumvent the decedent's clearly expressed wishes. She turned to Rebecca's legal team with a stern expression. I am scheduling a hearing for next month to determine whether sanctions are appropriate for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. In the meantime, this challenge to the will is dismissed with prejudice. The phrase dismissed with prejudice meant that Rebecca could not refile her challenge or attempt to bring the same claims again. Her legal assault on Richard's will was over, and she had lost completely. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to process. Relief that Richard's wishes would be honored and that his business would be protected. Sadness that my daughter had revealed herself to be someone I didn't recognize and couldn't respect. Rebecca and the Whitmores left the courthouse without speaking to us, but I could see in their faces that this defeat was not going to be the end of their efforts to gain control of Richard's assets. They might not be able to challenge the will anymore, but that didn't mean they would simply accept the situation and move on. The real battle for Richard's legacy was just entering a new phase, and I had a feeling it was going to get much more personal and much more vicious before it was over. I was right about the battle becoming more personal, but I underestimated just how far Rebecca and the Whitmores would go in their attempts to undermine Michael's management of Henderson Plumbing. The legal defeat in court had ended their direct challenge to Richard's will, but it had also made them more desperate and more willing to use underhanded tactics. The first sign of their new strategy came 3 weeks after the court dismissed Rebecca's case. Michael called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with stress and anger. "Mom, we have a problem," he said. 3 of our biggest commercial clients just canceled their contracts. All on the same day, all citing concerns about company stability and management competence. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. These were long-term clients who had worked with Richard for over a decade, and their sudden cancellations suggested that someone was spreading misinformation about the company's reliability. "Did they give any specific reasons?" I asked. "That's the weird part," Michael replied. "They all mentioned similar concerns. Rumors about family infighting affecting business operations, questions about my experience level, suggestions that the company might be sold or go out of business soon. It's like someone gave them all the same talking points." Within days, it became clear that Rebecca and Thomas were conducting a deliberate campaign to sabotage Henderson Plumbing by undermining client confidence and spreading rumors about management instability. Thomas had connections in the local business community through his family's investments, and he was using those connections to plant seeds of doubt about the company's future. The strategy was sophisticated and vicious. Rather than making direct attacks that could be traced back to them, Rebecca and Thomas were conducting a whisper campaign that was much harder to combat. They would express concern about Michael's inexperience to mutual acquaintances, they would mention family disputes that were affecting the business, and they would suggest that clients might want to diversify their vendor relationships to avoid being caught up in Henderson Plumbing's uncertain future. "It's brilliant in a sociopathic way," Daniel said during one of our crisis meetings at my house. "They can't get the will overturned, so they're trying to destroy the business value instead. If they can drive away enough clients and damage the company's reputation, Michael might be forced to sell just to prevent complete collapse." The sabotage campaign was having real effects. Henderson Plumbing lost 6 major clients in the span of 2 months, and several others were expressing concerns about renewing their contracts. The company's revenue dropped by 30%, forcing Michael to lay off 3 employees and postpone planned equipment upgrades. But if Rebecca and Thomas thought they could drive Michael to surrender, they had underestimated both his determination and his growing skill as a business leader. Instead of panicking or giving up, Michael began fighting back with the same values-based approach that had built Henderson Plumbing in the first place. He started by being completely transparent with existing clients about the family situation, explaining Richard's will and the legal challenge in straightforward terms that demonstrated the company's stability, rather than hiding information that was fueling rumors. "My father believed that this business was worth preserving," Michael would tell clients during personal meetings he scheduled with each one. "He trusted me to continue his commitment to honest work and fair dealing. I'm not going to let family conflicts prevent me from honoring that trust." The direct approach worked better than anyone had expected. Most clients appreciated Michael's honesty and were reassured by his detailed explanations of the company's financial stability and operational continuity. Several clients who had been wavering actually strengthened their relationships with Henderson Plumbing after Michael's candid conversations. Michael also began actively pursuing new business to replace the clients who had been driven away by Rebecca's sabotage campaign. He joined the Chamber of Commerce, started attending networking events, and began building relationships with contractors and property managers who hadn't been part of Henderson Plumbing's traditional client base. "Dad always said that good work speaks for itself," Michael told me during one of our weekly dinners. I'm not going to try to compete with Rebecca and Thomas on their level, spreading rumors and playing political games. I'm going to compete by doing better work than anyone else, and by treating people fairly. The strategy was paying off. By the end of the first year after the will reading, Henderson Plumbing had not only recovered the clients lost to sabotage, but had actually grown beyond its previous size. Michael's combination of Richard's traditional values with more modern marketing and business development techniques was creating new opportunities that hadn't existed before. But Rebecca's campaign wasn't limited to business sabotage. She also began working to isolate me socially and emotionally, apparently hoping to pressure me into intervening on her behalf with Michael and Daniel. She started by cutting off all personal contact, refusing to return my phone calls or acknowledge my birthday and Christmas cards. When I tried to reach out through Thomas, I was told that Rebecca was too hurt by my betrayal to maintain a relationship with me. The isolation campaign extended to the broader family as well. Rebecca began organizing holiday gatherings and family events that deliberately excluded me, Michael, and Daniel, while including extended family members and family friends. She would send invitations to cousins, aunts, uncles, and longtime family friends, but would make it clear that anyone who attended her events would not be welcome at gatherings that included the other side of the family. She's trying to force people to choose sides, my sister Patricia observed after being invited to one of Rebecca's exclusive holiday parties. She wants to make it look like you and the boys are the ones causing family division, rather than taking responsibility for her own actions. The strategy was partially successful. Some family members who were uncomfortable with conflict chose to maintain neutral relationships by simply avoiding gatherings altogether. Others, particularly older relatives who were confused about the details of the inheritance dispute, began treating me with the kind of polite distance that suggested they believed I was somehow responsible for the family rift. But Rebecca's most devastating tactic was using my relationship with my grandchildren as leverage in her campaign against Richard's will. Rebecca and Thomas had 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, who had been the lights of my life since they were born. I'd been their primary babysitter when Rebecca worked. I'd attended every school play and soccer game, and I'd spent countless hours reading stories, teaching them to bake cookies, and creating the kinds of memories that grandmothers treasure. After the will reading, Rebecca cut off my access to Emma and Tyler entirely. When I called to ask about visiting them, I was told that Rebecca felt it would be confusing for the children to maintain relationships with family members who were working against their mother's interests. You made your choice when you supported Richard's will instead of your own daughter, Rebecca told me during the one brief phone conversation she allowed about the children. Emma and Tyler need stability and consistency, not grandparents who prioritize business interests over family loyalty. The accusation that I was prioritizing business over family was particularly painful, because it was the exact opposite of the truth. I was defending Richard's business precisely because I believed it represented the values our family should uphold: integrity, hard work, commitment to community, and respect for the people who depend on us. But losing access to my grandchildren was devastating in a way that no business success could compensate for. Emma and Tyler were innocent victims of their mother's campaign, and they were being deprived of relationships that had been central to their lives since birth. I don't understand why we can't see Grandma anymore, Emma had apparently asked Rebecca, according to my sister Patricia, who heard the story from another family member. Did we do something wrong? The fact that Rebecca was willing to use her own children as weapons in her inheritance battle showed a level of callousness that I'd never imagined she was capable of. She was harming her own children to punish me for supporting Richard's wishes, and she seemed to feel completely justified in doing so. The emotional toll of losing my grandchildren while simultaneously watching my daughter reveal herself to be someone I didn't recognize was almost overwhelming. There were days when I wondered whether the fight to preserve Richard's legacy was worth the cost to our family relationships. But it was during my darkest moments that I would remember Richard's words about the importance of doing what's right even when it's difficult, and I would find the strength to continue supporting Michael and Daniel in their efforts to honor their father's wishes. And slowly, over the course of the next 2 years, the tide began to turn in ways that none of us had anticipated. Henderson Plumbing's success under Michael's management became impossible to ignore. The company was not only surviving, but thriving, adding new employees, expanding into new service areas, and earning recognition from trade associations and community organizations. Michael was proving that Richard's confidence in him had been well placed, and that the business could grow and evolve while maintaining its commitment to traditional values. More importantly, the contrast between Michael's success and Rebecca's bitter campaign of sabotage was becoming apparent to everyone who knew our family. While Michael was building something positive and constructive, Rebecca was devoting her energy to destruction and revenge. The turning point came during the 3rd year after Richard's death, when Rebecca and Thomas's own marriage began to show signs of serious strain. The stress of the inheritance battle, combined with the financial pressure of funding legal challenges and maintaining their lifestyle without the expected windfall from Richard's estate, was taking its toll on their relationship. Thomas had apparently been counting on Rebecca's inheritance to fund the investment firm he'd been planning, and the failure of their campaign to gain control of Richard's assets had left him looking for other opportunities. When those opportunities led him to spend increasing amounts of time away from home on business trips that Rebecca began to suspect were more personal than professional, their marriage started to unravel. The first sign of trouble came when Rebecca called me for the first time in over 2 years, asking if she could stop by to talk about something important. When she arrived at my house on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, she looked older and more fragile than I'd seen her since she was a teenager dealing with her first heartbreak. The confident, calculating woman who had whispered, "It's all ours now," at the will reading had been replaced by someone who seemed lost and uncertain. "Mom," she said, as we sat in my living room with cups of coffee that neither of us was drinking, "I think I've made some terrible mistakes." The admission was the first crack in the wall of anger and resentment that had separated us for 3 years, and I felt a surge of hope that maybe there was still a chance to rebuild our relationship. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked gently. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the rain, and clearly struggling with how to articulate what she was feeling. "I think I lost sight of what was really important," she said finally. "I got so focused on the money and what I thought I deserved that I forgot about everything else. I forgot about family, about Dad's values, about what kind of person I wanted to be." She paused, wiping away tears that had started to fall. "Thomas and I are getting divorced. He's been cheating on me with his business partner, and I found out that he's been planning to leave me anyway once he found other sources of funding for his investment firm. Apparently, I was never anything more than a path to Dad's money." The revelation was painful, but not entirely surprising. Thomas had always seemed more interested in Rebecca's inheritance prospects than in Rebecca herself, and his family's willingness to fund the legal challenge had clearly been motivated by financial opportunity rather than genuine concern for their daughter-in-law. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it completely despite everything that had happened between us. "I know you loved him." "I thought I did," Rebecca replied. "But I think what I really loved was the idea of being part of his family, of having access to their world. I wanted to be someone different than who I really was, and I was willing to sacrifice everything that actually mattered to get there." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, and for the first time in years, I saw glimpses of the daughter I'd raised, someone who was capable of reflection, growth, and genuine remorse for her mistakes. Rebecca acknowledged that her campaign against Richard's will had been motivated by greed and a sense of entitlement that she now recognized as toxic. She admitted that her treatment of Michael and Daniel had been unfair and destructive, and she expressed genuine regret for the damage she'd caused to our family relationships. "I can't undo what I've done," she said as our conversation wound down, "but I want to try to make things right if it's not too late." The process of reconciliation was slow and difficult, requiring Rebecca to take concrete steps to repair the damage she'd caused, rather than simply offering apologies and good intentions. She began by formally withdrawing from any remaining legal challenges to Richard's estate, and publicly acknowledging that Michael was the rightful manager of Henderson Plumbing. She reached out to business contacts who had been influenced by her sabotage campaign, and clarified that her previous concerns about the company had been motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate business issues. Most importantly, she started rebuilding relationships with Michael and Daniel, approaching them with genuine humility and a willingness to accept whatever role they were comfortable offering her in the family business and in their lives. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," she told Michael during their first conversation in 3 years. "I know I have to earn that back, but I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've done with Dad's business, and I'm sorry for trying to destroy something that clearly meant everything to him." Michael's response was cautious but generous. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things were," he said, "but I'm willing to try to move forward if you're serious about changing." The rebuilding process took time, but gradually, our family began to heal. Rebecca resumed her role as a silent partner in Henderson Plumbing, accepting her financial returns without attempting to influence business decisions. She started attending family gatherings again, and while the relationships were different than they'd been before, they were built on a more honest foundation. Most importantly, Rebecca allowed me to rebuild my relationship with Emma and Tyler, who had grown and changed significantly during the years we'd been separated. They were older now, and more aware of the family conflicts that had kept us apart, but they were eager to reconnect with the grandmother they remembered loving. "I missed you, Grandma," Emma told me during one of our first visits after the reconciliation. "Mommy said you were busy with important grown-up stuff, but I thought maybe you didn't want to see us anymore." The idea that my grandchildren had felt abandoned because of their mother's manipulation was heartbreaking, but it also motivated me to make sure that our rebuilt relationship would be strong enough to withstand any future family conflicts. Now, 5 years after that devastating will reading, our family has found a new equilibrium that honors Richard's memory, while acknowledging the complex realities of human relationships and personal growth. Henderson Plumbing is thriving under Michael's leadership, employing 23 people, and serving as a model for how traditional values can drive modern business success. Daniel has remained involved as a silent partner while building his own career, and he serves on the company's board of directors to provide oversight and strategic guidance. Rebecca has rebuilt her life after her divorce, focusing on raising Emma and Tyler while pursuing a master's degree in social work. She's channeled her intelligence and drive into helping other families navigate difficult transitions, and she's become an advocate for family counseling and conflict resolution. "I learned the hard way that money can't buy happiness or fix broken relationships," she told me recently. "But I also learned that it's never too late to change course if you're willing to do the hard work of becoming a better person." The inheritance that Rebecca had fought so hard to control continues to provide her with financial security, just as Richard had intended. But more importantly, she's learned to value the non-financial inheritance he left all of us, the example of integrity, hard work, and commitment to something larger than ourselves. As I sit in my garden on this sunny afternoon, 5 years after the will reading that nearly destroyed our family, I'm grateful for Richard's wisdom in structuring his estate the way he did. His restrictions prevented Rebecca from making irreversible mistakes while she was driven by greed and poor judgment, and they gave her time to grow and change before she gained full control over her inheritance. The 5-year restriction period is almost over now, and Rebecca will soon have the legal right to sell her share of Henderson Plumbing if she chooses to do so. But the woman who will make that decision is very different from the one who whispered, "It's all ours now," with such callous certainty. "I'm not going anywhere," Rebecca told Michael and Daniel during a recent family dinner. "Dad trusted us with his legacy, and I finally understand what that really means. Henderson Plumbing isn't just a business. It's a responsibility to our community, to our employees, and to the values that built our family." Richard's final clause had done exactly what he'd hoped it would do. It had protected his business and his values, while giving his daughter time to find her way back to the person he'd always believed she could become. The inheritance battle that began with greed and betrayal had ultimately taught all of us important lessons about loyalty, integrity, and the true meaning of family legacy. Money, we learned, is just a tool. What matters is how you use it, and what values guide your decisions. Richard Henderson built more than a successful business. He built a family foundation strong enough to survive even the worst storms, and wise enough to find its way back to what really matters in the end. That's an inheritance that no will can fully capture, and no legal challenge can ever take away.